So what's deep tech? Shobhankita, I think I've heard deep tech as a word, as a phrase being used a lot over the last 2, 3 years. And interestingly, before that, I had heard of moonshots from Y Combinator Startup School. But I hadn't heard a lot about deep tech from an Indian context, right? So I would want you to talk about what is deep tech from a very layman's perspective. How is it different from the tech, the normal startup tech versus what deep tech is? And yeah, let's start from that.
Awesome. No, I think it's a very important question because people have asked me, what is deep tech? What even is deep tech? And I remember many months ago when I told a friend of mine who works in the US that, I've joined Speciale, and Speciale is a deep tech VC. He had asked me, don't speak to me in Silicon Valley speak. Correct? So
Right.
let me explain that to you. Firstly, it's a relatively new term. I think it has only been around since about 2013, 14, and not before that. Obviously, what we call as deep tech has been around for a while, but the phrase itself is not more than 10 years old. But a good way to understand deep tech, I think, is deep science in tech. And what that means is anything that has huge basis in science and engineering, and it's a technology product that has a huge base in science and engineering, where the differentiation with this and any other approach to solving the same problem is technology.
Okay.
That then becomes deep tech. And so, think about space technologies, semiconductors, energy transition, alternative materials, applied electronics. So many of these sectors are based in research and development, huge R&D investments, and they take a lot of time and capital to come to fruition. These might be lab prototypes that are looking to get commercialized. The market need is very, very clear, but just that journey to coming to market, commercializing it, and making a product out of it, and figuring out your unit economics and business model is going to be the challenge.
Right.
But apart from that, the technology itself is not fully ready. Correct?
Okay.
That would be deep tech. And so all of these sectors that I had mentioned, all of them have flavors of deep tech. Deep
Right.
tech sector, as much as every other sector, could have flavors of deep tech, because anything that requires sufficiently technology differentiation to play out is deep tech. I mean, think about it, right? Google started out as a research project by PhD students. At that time, if we had today's lingo, Google was a deep tech startup. Today,
Right.
not so much, because what's deep tech today might not be deep tech tomorrow, because technology changes and advances and evolves. And so I would say industrial revolution that we have had is deep tech in its own way, but we've never called it particularly that. But it is advancements and breakthroughs in fundamental. The coming of internet is deep. The coming of some of our defense technologies is deep tech.
Right.
Of AI and semiconductor and robotics and all of this is deep tech. Even in that, some is, we wouldn't consider certain things to be deep tech, even within AI, because it depends on how difficult it is for somebody else to be building what you're building. Do you know that, I think the differentiation is also that how replicable is this particular thing? Is this particular technology product to something else? And is that differentiation not just incremental, but exponential? Correct?
Okay.
People tend to think deep tech is just hardware, but that's not true. Deep tech is also software. But the nuance is then understanding the difficulty in building that product, in being able to execute on that product. Is that sufficiently deep tech is the subjective question to be asked. And so usually what we see is founders come from backgrounds that are particularly R&D led. They've gained experience in a few things that very few others have, and they've gone very deep in that. They've built expertise in that, and it's very much technology research oriented, and they're able to combine some of these technologies together to build that product. And so that interconnection between multiple technologies also constitutes deep tech, because very few people can do multiple things and bring it together and make that work. So yeah, I think that's the lay of the land as to what deep science in tech is. And think about it, right? If you're going behind and building something that very few other people can, it's also true that your customers will only come to you because you're able to solve a problem to them that very few other competitors can. And so the advantage of building a deep tech product then becomes that you can command higher prices on your product, and you can have higher margins on your product, and you can be a premium company and a premium product. And so just that value addition, apart from fundamental breakthroughs and technology breakthroughs, it also translates to, how much price is your customer willing to pay, because very few others can solve that problem for him or her.
Right.
I think that is, in very long words, what deep tech is.
So if I had to break it down and make it very simple, deep tech startups where tech is not just playing the role of a facilitator, but instead it's the core of the product, right? Where the real innovation is happening.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Innovation, I feel, can happen at multiple places in a business, right? You can innovate on how you're selling the product, or maybe how you're branding yourself, or the kind of folks that you're hiring, or maybe even the business model, right? But it can also happen when it's purely tech driven, right? And probably, so another thing that I understood here is that over a period of time, all technologies will, stop being deep tech, but they were deep tech at some point of time in their life cycle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So probably AR, VR is still somewhat deep tech. It was even more deep tech, say 4 or 5 years ago, but probably in future it would not be considered as a part of deep tech, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that also makes me think about the risks of investing in deep tech, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. We were talking about technology which so far may or may not have been adopted at scale, right? Because a lot of these technologies are coming from a typical R&D space. So, I mean, isn't that like a very big risk from an investment perspective? And if yes, how do VCs like Speciale or the other top VCs in this space, how do you guys navigate in terms of figuring out, okay, this is a technology which is likely to get adopted and this is one which might not?
So I think in terms of market risk, deep tech startups actually have smaller market risk than traditional conventional tech companies. And the reason is that in most cases, deep tech startups are going behind such fundamental problems that if you can solve that problem, albeit via a very deep tech approach, if you can solve that problem, then the market need for a solution is very clear. The receipt of that product is very clear. Customers are willing to pay for it. So market risk is not actually something that's as big as traditional conventional startups. Okay. What is higher, however, is the risk for scale up, is the need for higher capital, is the risk for commercialization and productization. Because you have maybe only a prototype that's working in some conditions, but will this work to the same degree and to the extent that it's expected to in real life settings? And what does that convert to when it's commercialized and productized? And so it's very different kinds of risks. And for example, the likes of Speciale are willing to enter at TRL4 level. And TRL is technology readiness level, right? Like what level of TRL are you at? And so maybe government grants, etc., help at TRL 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 5, 6 is where something like a Speciale would come in. And so that technology risk is still being underwritten. And that's something that, for example, a firm such as Speciale is willing to underwrite. Maybe another firm will not be willing to underwrite that. They're willing to underwrite for market risk, but not technology risk. They're not willing to underwrite for commercialization and productization risk as much as maybe Speciale is. And so I think every startup, especially in the early stages, has risk. It's just that the kinds of risks that deep tech companies have are different to the ones that traditional companies might have.
I also think that it must be difficult for, say, someone who's coming from non-technical background or understanding to be able to evaluate deep tech startups, right? Is it true? And how did you, as someone who, for that matter, you kind of figured out your way or navigated your way into VCs? How did you adapt to it? What were the things that you read about, or in case, say, someone wants to build a startup in this space, or just be more informed about what's going on in deep tech? Are there any specific places that they can go to learn more about this?
So I think in the early stages, yes, you're absolutely right. It's a very different lens to investing that deep tech has, because you cannot get on a call with the founder and ask, what revenue do you have? Perhaps only a prototype. It's still a work in progress. There's just so much to be figured out that it's not yet ready for customers to pay for the product yet. There is perhaps no product yet. And so I think it's a very different lens to underwriting risk. It's a very different lens to looking at the whole investing DNA and thesis that you might have. In the later stages, however, I think a deep tech company is very similar to any other kind. Because at that point, it's just a company that's revenue generating. It's got its own customer pipeline. It's got customers who can speak for it. Technology risk at that point, if customers are already using it, means that technology risk has been, kind of cleared out for. And so at that point in time, I think it's very similar that what deep tech companies have as well as others. But in the early stages, like you rightly pointed, it's very, very different. And so I think the lens to investing has to be different. How we approach it at Speciale is very much being sector driven. And we're very sector first in the sense that we go very deep into some of these sectors, understand the nitty-gritties of, what is the sector breakdown like? What are the different things that encompass the sector? And being able to understand that, being able to speak to researchers, being able to speak to professors in universities, being able to speak to incubators and accelerators who have been doing this for a while now, as well as trying to understand government policy, because some of these sectors are regulated. We forget that space, semiconductors, EV, AI, all of these are to some extent regulated sectors. And so being able to see the government policy side of things and being able to put all of this together and say, if this works out, what is the upside versus the downside?
Sure.
If the founder can pull this off and solve for technology because maybe he or she has that skill set, has that background, has learned, picked that up through their background experience and background. What does that together encompass? And being able to underwrite that risk, I think it's an art. It's not a science that can be broken down.
Right.
Only about 18 months in, I'm just trying to learn and figure that out for myself. And I think everyone does it in their own. Every investor does it in their own way. And so that's the lay of the land of deep tech investing, especially in the early stage, because I think you have to be a little mad to go and invest in some of these really exotic sounding ideas, but that's the.
So how did you find your way into it? I mean, how did you read about it? What are the sources that you followed that, say folks who are probably watching this or listening to this could also just go to and understand deep tech better? Because whenever I think about exotic technologies, or for that matter, something that I don't understand because I come from a non-tech background, so I find it very difficult sometimes to even understand what certain folks specifically coming from an R&D space are kind of talking about, right? It would be super exciting, but then say if I want to kind of understand what's going on, and I want to specifically try and understand the basics of it. Is there a process that you follow for yourself?
I think right now there's just a lot of material available on deep tech because deep tech has become such a catch-all phrase.
Yeah.
Because I think there's just a lot of content now that you can read up on and familiarize yourself. But I think the day-to-days of the job requires you to go into, at least in the early stages, into the nitty-gritties of the sector, to be able to take the sector. And so I think a passion for technology, a flair to understand that is very, very helpful. Otherwise, there is a difference between what the founder is speaking as well as what you're hearing. And in so many of the cases, some of these founders are extremely, PhD researchers.
Yeah.
They speak a certain language, and if you're not able to even, be on the same wavelength with them, I think it becomes very difficult. So I think a passion for technology helps in the stage that Speciale operates in, which is pre-seed and seed. But I would think by the time you're Series A, Series B, you can look at other metrics and not so much only technology. And at that stage, it's okay that you understand the sector at a very broad level and approach like any other sector. But I think in the earlier stages, you still need to go into the nitty-gritties of technology and understanding that. And so I think it depends on the stage what you would need to learn up and read up about.
But there's no specific newsletter, or say, if I just want to get a overall understanding of the space, is there something that you'd recommend, a book or thesis, like say a series of books or articles which you follow?
No, actually, I don't think things are so structured yet when it comes to deep tech space. But I think firms such as Speciale, we have a monthly newsletter. We have an in-sync with Speciale where we put out the latest developments in the tech space and following that and trying to understand what are all the advancements happening in the space of different sectors and kind of then follow and go from there. So I think it just starts with market trends, technology trends, and then working backwards from there. And there are multiple resources to be doing that.
So what is Speciale's thesis? If you could just talk about it. in terms of how is it different from other deep tech VCs? What is it actually looking for? And I mean, how is it able to kind of, I mean, it has definitely built a name. A lot of people, I think most of the folks that I've interacted with know very well about Speciale Deep Tech. It's very, very popular. It's a very big name in space now. So what makes it what it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think Speciale has been among the early believers of deep tech from India.
Right. Absolutely.
Right? So 2016, 2017, firm started purely focused on deep tech from India.
Very few people even talked about it back then, I suppose.
Yeah, very, very gutsy to be doing this. I think the evolution for Speciale has been like this, right? Not so much Speciale, sorry, cut that. The evolution of the Indian startup ecosystem as Speciale sees it is that we started out with services companies and BPO from India, correct? We had business process outsourcing from India for the longest time. Then we built our own services companies, which are, the likes of Wipro, TCS, Infosys, the one that I previously worked at. And the evolution of that was offshore product offices of the likes of Yahoo and Google coming to India. So, early 2000s, Yahoo had an office in Bangalore, for example. So, we had technology product companies building offshore offices in India. And then I think we had a little wave that started about 2010, and we started seeing product companies from India. And Flipkart is a huge success, acquisition by Walmart and all of that. And so we started from that building services companies to building product companies. And I think the next leg of innovation has to be R&D and research led, and that's the pivot, and that's the evolution that Speciale is kind of banking on. And back in 2016, 2017, I think very few in the ecosystem kind of believed that. But I think there are different reasons to believe that deep tech from India will take off, right? Like, for example, I think the latest GitHub report says that there are about 13 million developers on GitHub from India alone. We are the second largest contributor of AI and AI projects globally. And think about semiconductor talent. Much of the design talent in the world is Indian. Think about what a phenomenal institution we've built in ISRO, and from that the space tech industry broadly. Once that industry got privatized to some extent, we began to see just the potential of that sector for India. So just the kind of talent we have, and some of these sectors being regulated means that a lot of folks who might have been trained in universities abroad are coming back to India to start up on their own. And so there is that inflow of talent, as well as, also regulation that's very helpful. There is the national deep tech startup policy. Each of the sectors that I spoke of now have their own policies and draft policies. And so I think that ecosystem is now very much ready for deep tech from India. And so that seems to be the Speciale belief for a long time, but also so many other deep tech investors now being able to see all of these tailwinds and say, looks like this is going to be, like a fast growing sector in the next couple of years. And that's why you hear, I think, so much more of deep tech the last 2-3 years. But Speciale has been at the space the last 7 years when very few people would have believed in the sector. And so I think that's why Speciale is special in some way.
Right. Interesting wordplay. So I think what I really wanted to understand is, I mean, there are few more VCs which invest in deep tech, right? And this is like more of a generic question. Say if you're working with one specific VC and you look at other VCs also going in for same deal, right? Does thesis play a role in terms of helping you make a decision in those scenarios? And how, I mean, I understand that Speciale was one of the first VCs to kind of back deep tech. But is there any other difference as well in the thesis in terms of how Speciale looks at startup and from as compared to say other deep tech VC would look at a deep tech startup? Is there a difference in perspective? And if yes, can you talk about it?
I think the difference is in how much of that risk are you willing to underwrite? For example, Speciale is willing to be the first institutional investor into the startups that it invests in. What that means is when so much more needs to be figured out, Speciale is willing to invest. and take that leap of faith on other metrics that they have built on based on the thesis.
Right.
Very few deep tech VCs come in as early as Speciale does.
Yeah.
And take the kind of extravagant risks that Speciale is willing to. There are firms that invest slightly different check sizes, mostly larger check sizes. And so I think the difference is in what you consider deep tech as well, because I think that's subjective. What is deep tech for you might not be deep tech for me. This is more painful and just that much more harder to qualify something as deep tech for one fund versus another. For some, if you're operating anything in AI, you're deep tech. But somebody else, that is not true. They go into the nitty-gritties of what is the most hard piece here to build, and then they kind of underwrite their risk based on that. So I think the difference is in perception, the difference is in subjectivity, being able to understand the sector, being able to just define their definition of deep tech.
Right.
I think it's not a clear-cut answer also because, every business is different, every sector is different. And so how do you, have your own catch-all for deep tech? It's so varied. And so I think, very, very different in terms of how you might view it as opposed to the other. But then there are always companies that, every firm believes in, maybe because of the market potential, maybe because of the problem they're solving, maybe because of the founders that are leading the startup. And so then it becomes a matter of, which VC firm gets to work with the founder, because then the founder can choose who he or she wants to partner with, as well as the price, the valuation, all of that particular startup. But I think the difference then is that comfort zone that the founder and building for the long haul.
So valuation seems to be a pretty, tricky, I think a tricky thing to understand when it comes to deep tech startups, at least for somebody like me. Because when you look at, service-driven stuff, so your so-called typical product companies, you look at D2C startups, edtechs, fintechs, I mean, they're very defined models in terms of how to go about valuing these startups, right? In a lot of cases, you look at user acquisition. A lot of cases, you can look at revenues, entry barriers, founding team, right? I understand that some of this would be common for deep tech as well. Maybe the founding team plays a very, very large role, I suppose, because of the kind of scientific endeavor and maybe the technical understanding of the technology that these folks are building. But apart from that, is there anything else? And if yes, how does a typical standard valuation process look like? Because I understand that probably would be a difficult question for you to answer, because there's nothing called standard way to value when it comes to startups, especially early stage startups. It's pretty much in the air. But still, how do you evaluate startups? How do you figure out their so-called right valuation, especially when the startups are building a technology which is fairly new, which I think might happen a lot when you're investing in deep tech, right?
Yeah. No, I think when it comes to valuation, it's just a very difficult question. And here's the thing, right? Most valuations are determined by exit outcomes. So if you know that a particular company in a particular sector can be acquired for this price, you work backwards from it and say, if I can give it this valuation in its first round of dilution, it will still work out for me when it gets acquired at this particular price. Correct. So valuations are usually worked backward from that. For example, maybe in software companies, we're working as revenue multiples of their revenue. Revenue multiples of ARR. Correct. So what ARR, annual recurring revenue, do they have? I'll give a certain revenue multiple of that, and that's going to be their valuation. And I can get this revenue multiple number from public companies. I can get this from other acquisitions in similar space in the recent past. Correct. But when it's a new sector, when it's a new technology, especially when deep tech from India is still very nascent and we've not seen as many exits as we would like, and it's still a work in progress, the entire story, I think we don't know what the right acquisition value might be, the IPO price might be, etc. We can only gauge. And I think to that extent, most VC firms are playing conservatively. They're giving conservative valuations, conservative prices, because so much is left to be figured out. So much of that exit outcomes are left to be figured out. So a work in progress. And to some extent, because Speciale comes in as early as we did, back from 2016, 2017, we've been backing deep tech from India. And we also come in extremely early as pre-seed, seed stage investors. So I think Speciale, to some extent, is setting the price at least for the portfolio companies and everything else that we have operated in the last 7 years. And we'll wait to see what that turns out to be a couple of years down the line. Yeah.
So does conservative valuations today also have something to do with the current economy in terms of where we are at? Also, like a follow-up question to this, how do you rate the current infrastructure for deep tech in India as compared to, say, more developed countries which with stronger infrastructures like, say, US or maybe, I don't know, Japan?
So I think conservative valuations or whatever, right? Like valuations firstly are a reflection of what you think you can make out of this particular investment.
Right.
So at the seed stage, if I'm able to invest in a particular startup and give it a 30 million valuation, it's because I believe, or I'm led to believe, or I'm excited to believe that it will give me that much more multiple from this valuation price. And
Right.
so uncertain, and when the risk you're taking is very high, as is in the case of deep tech, because so much is yet to be figured out, or in the case of a bad economy or just negative sentiment in the overall economy that you don't know what the prices can be in the future, then you just don't know what can come out of.
So, Shubhankita, where are we as a country, as a nation, as compared to, say, Western countries, more developed nations like US? So, on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being, say, the more advanced Western countries in terms of infrastructure to build new technologies, where would you rate India? And a follow-up question to that is, do you think India would have its own OpenAI or a competitor to OpenAI in the coming months?
So I think as compared to the Western markets, we're still very nascent, right? We're absolutely still very nascent. The ecosystem is just about coming in together, which is the policy, the regulation, which is the incubators, the accelerators, all the top engineering and research organizations in India, including the IITs. But Spilani has recently opened up a startup policy for its students where they help with pre-incubating support and all of that. If the student chooses to not do like a thesis in college, but decides to start up. So I think all of this is just about coming together now. And we spoke of also talent, that a lot of people are coming back, trained abroad in universities and now coming back to build their own startup because some of these sectors are very regulated. So I think all of this is coming in just together now. A lot of corporate ventures programs in some of these sectors are actively looking to invest in India as well. For example, Shell Ventures, Qualcomm Ventures.
Yeah.
All of them are very much in India, tracking the sectors, tracking the trends, looking to invest. And so I think it's just about coming together. It'll be very soon, in a couple of years' time, that some of these get acquired, either by the likes of the corporate companies that we spoke of, but also maybe homegrown companies. Yeah. Reliance has been acquiring a lot of retail companies. Tomorrow it might acquire, energy transition, new age energy companies, correct? So some of these in-house as well as foreign companies looking to acquire, that exit ecosystem kind of opening up. I think all of that is still very nascent. So growing in India at this point in time. And, in the US, we have venture studios. We have concepts like this where a VC firm, incubates its own startup and kind of takes a larger equity, but at the same time, puts together the entire team and product and prototype and all of that to make it work. All of those setups are fewer in India at this point in time. And so we are experimenting with ways to incentivize researchers, such as the one that Spilani did, which is, just to have students start up more. There are more incubators, accelerators. NASCOM has its own deep tech, community around it where they're helping deep tech startups. BIRAC for biotech, METI for IT and electronics related companies. All of them have their own little ways of helping startups, but I think the gap as to what is required for founders versus what the ecosystem is doing continues to be high, but I think that's bridging. And so it's very optimistic a place to be about deep tech in India from, right now.
So no OpenAI's competitor basically in the next few years.
I think we will have. And I think there are a lot of contenders already, right?
Right.
There is Sarvam AI, there is Krutrim AI, AI for Bharat. So some of these folks trying to build Indic language models, trying to say that we have all of these languages that are Indian and regional, but at the same time, there's vast knowledge that has never been digitized, that has never been processed, that has never been annotated. How can we bring all of this into the realm of intelligence for AI and at the same time build apps for India that benefit the masses? So I
Right.
think there needs to be, and I think there will be as well. And definitely, I'm not the only one to believe this, because all the companies I mentioned have been heavily funded, and so there are others like me and other VCs and the ecosystem believing in the possibility of something for India coming up from Indians and in Indian languages.
Right. So you talked about most of the deep tech startups being acquired, right? And I think does that have something to do with the current stage of Indian startups from a global perspective, or does it have more to do with the fact that right now we're not probably there in terms of as an ecosystem to ensure that a lot of these deep tech startups end up with an IPO, for an exit?
So I personally don't believe that IPO means success, acquisition means less success.
Of course, no, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, think about Flipkart, right? It was an acquisition, but it's the biggest exit we've seen. $15 billion, something like that, right? $20 billion, yeah. So, I mean, crazy kind of valuation, and was purely acquired, right? So, it's not true that only IPOs give back the kind of returns to investors and acquisitions don't. So, that's purely true. And at least that's, I mean, look at the largest acquisition we have had. It's not IPO. Having said that, I think the bar to go IPO, especially in the US now, is that much higher, because it's the largest thriving, ecosystem in terms of public markets, and you can be like what $20-30 million ARR company, and no one would bat an eyelid, because look at the top 5 companies trading on the same market, and they are equivalent to GDPs of countries, and so. I think the bar to go public in the US is that much higher. And so people would prefer to go, especially now that the IPO market in India looks a lot more conducive since, the opening of the market for Zomato and recently Mamaearth and, a couple companies in between. I think the Indian IPO market very much looks approachable, especially given that some of these sectors are novel, and some of these companies are likely to get that sector premium, that tech premium, when they trade in the Indian public markets. So I think that is very much an option available, which is the Indian public markets itself. And acquisitions, obviously, because if there is a synergy between the acquiring company and the startup in terms of the product line, the founding team's capability and strength, it's that much more. It just makes sense for it to be acquired for that strength, because if that acquiring company needed to build this capability, this product, this team in-house, it might take them 6 to 12 months. But here you pay a little extra upfront, and you acquire this company, and you're able to integrate it into your business line and increase your revenues that much faster, which is essentially what every acquiring company is thinking. You could do it in-house. Of course you could, but you don't want to. You don't want to take that time. Correct? And so you acquire this, the capability, the strengths, the product, their network, their capabilities, all of that together, and you can expand it instead of building all of that in-house, and it's ready to go from tomorrow in a way that doesn't take us long. And so I think a lot of premiums can also come purely from acquisitions.
There's been a lot of noise around AI as a sector lately, right? I think probably OpenAI and some of the newer players have kind of played a very big role in terms of suddenly ushering in that age of AI, I'd say. But I've kind of heard some very interesting opinions around AI, from folks who actually invest in startups. So, I was actually speaking with somebody who's a prominent figure who kind of shared that when it comes to artificial intelligence, this is not the right time to invest, because so many of these startups, which are actually good, actually building something that can possibly create a disruption, being very, very highly valued, to an extent where it doesn't make sense to invest in them, right? From a purely VC thesis in terms of the kind of returns that they'd expect, right? Because VCs typically expect a 30x, 50x, 100x kind of multiples on the valuation over a period of time. What are your thoughts on it? Because and I think I've got some very interesting analogies over here, right? Some people have ended up comparing it with, what was going on with the crypto world, right? If we talk about 2020, 2021, crazy valuations, 2019, right? And then all of a sudden, everything kind of settling down and there being like a massive correction. And now things being so much better for crypto and NFTs in general as a space to kind of go ahead and invest in, because Bitcoin is significantly more stable than it ever was. Do you think that such a correction is expected in AI? Or, in case folks who are kind of holding back right now will just end up missing the train?
No, it's a very interesting question, and one that we have spoken about more than anything else the last 12, 15 months, I think. One is that there is still a lot to be figured out with AI today, right? I mean, OpenAI has come and made all the noise that it has, and rightfully so. But the truth is, there is still privacy and security concerns with using AI in an enterprise setting in a way that makes sense to the confidentiality of a business. Where is the moat? If somebody else can build this super fast, super cheap, then where is the moat and differentiation in this particular startup over another, especially in the early days, before moats can form? So I think where is the moat becomes a question. And is anything as difficult in AI to be built today, or is it just a matter of the next OpenAI release?
Right. Yeah.
If tomorrow they launch something and release something, is that the end of a couple startups? And that's been a true problem with a lot of founders, because they can never innovate as fast as a properly funded research-led team in the Valley can, correct, with the kind of backing that OpenAI currently has. And so I think a lot of yet to be figured out questions with generative AI. And the other last bit, I think, is just accuracy. Because we talk about LLM hallucinations, they are not perfect features. They are not perfect, answer writing machines. They make mistakes as well. They make up things. They don't say what's completely true. And so how much can you believe it? If you don't believe it, can you use it in mission critical settings? And some mission critical settings would be inside of an enterprise to be able to trust that system. And the added pressure of privacy and security concerns, is it possible that you can take this whole thing seriously? So I think these are all the problems with generative AI as it stands today. And I think these are research problems that over a period of time will have to get solved. At least that's what I believe. But about investing in AI startups today, I think being able to, find the diamonds in the dust is that much harder, because it's so easy to start up today and be a generative AI startup, because you can work off an OpenAI API. You can work off another open source LLM API, and you can build your own thing together. And you never know how much of this will break down once that API breaks down. So I think the question really then becomes being able to find that diamond in the dust, to forget the noise, because the noise is real, and at the same time, the excitement that people are voicing is also real, I think. But the truth is, if everybody is excited about something, it just means that the price of that goes up purely through that exuberance. And that price makes sense a couple years later when the dust settles and we have identified the diamonds from the dust, as it were. And so I think the question then becomes what price to enter into at this point in time. Does it make sense to enter into, because that needs to become usable and worthy for a standalone business to thrive. Because at the end of the day, you're not building AI, you're still building a company that happens to be using AI or in AI. And so the metrics of this company giving you outcomes will still be how much of a company can it be built as?
Sure.
As a valid business model can it have? How does the unit economics look? And so many of these things are not figured out yet, because you don't know how much is going to be your OpenAI API cost. You don't know what your cloud costs are going to be. You don't know how much you can charge your customer. So what does your unit economics look like? No one knows. So many of these things not figured out. I think the question then becomes, do we invest in? I think you absolutely should, but that much more caution in exercising that investment. And so I think that much more requirement to look closely and learn that much more and invest that much more cautiously.
So, considering that we're talking about AI, when Sam Altman was ousted from OpenAI, I think the core concern was whether they are building AI for good, right? And people like Ilya Sutskever being like, biggest of the voices around AI have kind of talked about this very openly, that there could be certain concerns. I think Elon Musk himself put out certain statements talking about how AI could also be dangerous. So as a VC, how do you look at this? And is there a specific thought that goes into your thesis when you're investing in certain AI startups?
I think as a VC, you're firstly very optimistic because that's the nature of the business, right? You're underwriting so many risks.
Right.
90%, 95% of startups fail, and yet at the earliest stages, we continue to believe and do this for a profession and do this day in and day out. And so that level of optimism and looking on the upside and not so much on the downside, I think, is one of the traits that a VC needs to have. And I think this is no different. But the truth of the matter is, yes, absolutely. I think we wouldn't do things that we are not comfortable with. I've heard of companies that help you dating apps, but only voice based, because the idea is you don't want to be judged by how you look, and so it's purely on your voice. Crazy ideas like that. But I think at some level we are also looking for fundamental breakthroughs, fundamental technologies, because they have a societal impact. And I think as much as we are in this for the financial returns, we're also doing this, day in and day out, and putting the amount of time and passion, also because we think there is a larger story to be said here, which is societal impact, which is for good. And so we might not admit it very openly, because I think it's still a capitalistic job. In the sense that you're doing this for returns, but at the same time, you're looking to make long-term standing businesses. And if the business doesn't last very long, you're not going to make money. And so it's very interlinked that you do something that's keeps your conscience clear, because you might do something and it might not work out. So might as well do something that, your conscience be able to that. And then kind of also make returns, because you will make returns if you build or invest or help build generational companies. I think they're all interlinked.